How are you?
I'm doing great. Very cool to see you. I've actually met you when you lived in Charlotte, North Carolina. So where are you right now, and what keeps you busy these days?
Yeah, I feel like it's been a while. Um, I think it's been maybe 8 years or so since we've met. Yeah, I have been living in Switzerland for the last 2.5 years, Lausanne, Switzerland, in the French-speaking part. And as you know, I'm sort of ingrained in the digital health, digital therapeutic space, but have added on my plate in the last 2.5 years, the financial side. I have been working with a few VCs, including I'm on the board of world's largest impact fund on a number of innovation projects. I do due diligence, do my own angel investment, have a a handful of startups I really believe in the space, which utilize a number of advanced technologies like AI, ML, IoT, blockchain. Yeah, so I would say staying in my lane, so to speak, in my industry, but expanded the list of daily tasks.
For this conversation, I wanted us to talk about the topic that you mentioned briefly, AI, and more specifically, Chat GPT, because I know you joined some of Kepler Tech Talks when AI was not as tangible in the lives of many people. So could you talk a little bit specifically about GPT-4 and what impact do you see it's making on decision makers and decision-making process for investors, advisors, and founders in the health tech space?
Yeah, so I think I'm considered by some people as a pioneer in the healthcare space deploying AI for value-based care. And I think it's been personally very interesting to see how far we've come. And we still have ways to go, but the future is exciting. And I think that, overall, I'm a proponent of AI, and I utilize in my daily basis Chat GPT in Chat GPT-3, actually, as it was released. And I think just for all intents and purposes, it might make sense to summarize a few benefits and drawbacks, right? So on one end, whether you are an entrepreneur, an investor, Chat GPT-4 allows for faster decision making and ability to process a large data set in a short period of time. And of course, with Chat GPT-4, we see improved accuracy and increased efficiency. Now, I think it's also important to mention a few drawbacks, right? So, I'm in the healthcare space and digital therapeutics. In some instances, whether it is you are an entrepreneur, an investor, empathy is required. And of course, ChatGPT-4 lacks empathy. Although it's very interesting to note that recently there was a new study that was released. I don't know if you read it or not. And when it comes to patient engagement and empathy, actually ChatGPT-4 won the scorecard, right, against the clinicians. And I think as a patient advocate, I was excited to see that perhaps it provides a learning opportunity for clinicians as well, because not only ChatGPT-4 was able to provide accurate clinical answer, also it was an answer that had the sympathetic approach and allowed for patients to be more engaged if they had follow-up questions. And of course, there was no constraint of time. So I think the optimal answer from patient perspective was achieved, rather than, physicians usually have the lack of time there. And of course, that impacts. So, although we'll still list lack of empathy as a drawback, because I think it's an area that still requires some improvement, especially as far as healthcare space is concerned. And, possible bias. I think that's a That's a huge drawback, especially in the healthcare space, where patient populations are diverse. Even if I'm currently living in Europe, but even in the United States, it's a large patient population, multilingual. Some live in rural areas, some are more educated when it comes to technology, some are less. You have the age difference, and list goes on. So it really is important, especially in the healthcare space, right, where we can potentially impact um, patient outcomes to really work on decreasing the bias. And again, to summarize all of it, so Chat GPT-4 is allowing both investors and innovators to ultimately, it leads to more innovation, right? But also allows for investors to be more accurate. But you have to, with all the possibilities, you have to keep in mind a few shortcomings of this technology.
There's a lot to unpack in what you shared, but I wanted to start with something very practical. What I have experienced, I liked, for example, Chat GPT-4 to review my emails. And both of us are not like native English speakers. And I know you've been in the US probably longer than I was, but I still feel sometimes the way I articulate things is not ideal. And ChatGPT has been a good tool for me to improve the clarity of communication and a check-in. But what I see that where the danger is, you like over-reliance. So when you start over-relying on ChatGPT, you can skip over certain things. And when it comes to big investment decisions or life and death decisions, this is where I see a lot of danger, especially if you throw a bunch of information on at it without like double checking. What's your thought on this? Do you see a risk in this like very human way? Once you like a tool, you start overusing it.
So I do love your examples, and I think, again, in the healthcare space, and I think this is one of the reasons why the industry generally is very cautious when it comes to deployment of innovation. It's like industry waits for others to sort of test it out, and then we're still resistant. We go through a lot of like, hey, it doesn't really work in healthcare, although it seems to work everywhere else. But I think one of the main reasons is because the impact, right? And so I think on one end, when it comes to healthcare space, right, so there are a number of startups that have deployed the tech successfully, including for assistance in decision-making. So over-reliance, to your point, and the right, could lead to some costly mistakes and it could be literally costly, right? Because, wrong tests are performed. And it could lead to potentially a misdiagnosis. So I think cautious approach that we typically deploy in the healthcare space, I think in this case is quite useful. So I don't foresee personally, again, I'm only speaking for healthcare and pharma, I don't see per se over-reliance just because of the cultural, just the culture of industries. So I see mostly benefits, I would say, but although, with some drawbacks that I just mentioned earlier.
Sure. I wanted to show you, and this is something I came across a few days back. There is a guy, Bertolan Mesko, and I think I read one of his books. And recently he published this list of companies. And I don't know if it's visible. So these are, it lists healthcare companies across the world that have used ChatGPT, like Nuance Communication, Medical Note-Taking, Nabla Transcribe, Video Conversations, Doximity prepares referrals. Epic at a recent HIMSS announced that they are going to integrate into electronic medical records. Like there are a clinical reasoning tool by Kehon, fitness content services, health management wearables, private hospitals. So it looks like bionic health. There are a number of organizations jumping into that space. And I wanted to kind of continue the point about like risk. One is very human, like over-reliance, and you addressed that. But there is the issue of data monopolization, trade secrets, because everything you give, at least in the chat form, perhaps not through the API interface, is being used by OpenAI to train its data. So what's your perspective on this aspect of data monopolization and trade secrets, specifically in the context of Chat GPT?
Of course. Well, first of all, just so we're on the same page, what is data monopolization? It usually occurs when a company, an entity has exclusive access to a large data set, and or I should say to a large amount of data in general. And that could give them a potential competitive advantage, but it could also suppress collaboration. It could suppress creativity. It could suppress innovation in general, right? And potentially lead to misuse of data. And then the trade secrets, on the other hand, right? So this is a legally protected information that's confidential. And it allows for companies in some instances to have competitive advantage, which in the investor space we value, right? But also, again, it could limit collaboration in the industry. In the healthcare and pharma industry, are notoriously famous for lack of collaboration. So I think impact in the healthcare and pharma is greater than in the other industries. So in the context of ChatGPT, again, data monopolization and trade secrets could result in a lack of diversity in the market, because only select companies could have access to the data or technology in general. And also, again, this is healthcare specific, I would say, right? You could have not enough funding to invest in in a certain technology. And then additionally, I just talked a little bit about the culture of the industry, right? So with the lack of technical training, it could not be understood at large, right? The technology is needed and could indeed make a positive impact. So I think so the obvious answer to this is improved transparency and the collaboration. And I think regulation is really important as well. So especially in the healthcare space, innovation is always driven by regulation and reimbursement, especially in the United States. So I think
Sasha, I'll ask you more questions about regulation, but I wanted to dig a little bit into, like, on the trade secret side, if we take this aspect. I think it's been a few weeks since some like proprietary code of Samsung ended up in ChatGPT responses, just because developers have used ChatGPT to help them write code. And as you know, it gives access to OpenAI to this data. Right now, some publishers are suing or trying to get like some kind of compensation from OpenAI because ChatGPT was trained on the books that are proprietary. So in the context of this, like one company, one organization gets to train its model on this proprietary data, potentially exposing some trade secrets, and people who are not realizing this in healthcare space and in other spaces start relying and sharing confidential information with ChatGPT, and it is already leading to some problems because we're not trained and we may not realize that this is happening. So this is on the trade secret side that I feel is, again, a very human thing, but also a legal thing. Do you have a perspective on this, or what's your thought on this particular situation?
Well, I think there are a couple of things here. So on one end, again, regulation is needed to give a framework for what that should look like, right? So if the information is public, again, you could deploy this information, and we do deploy this information as innovators. But in the same time, if entire value proposition is based on the IP of another company, right? So this creates a legal conversation at the very least, but there are some ramifications. So again, I think this particular example highlights for me a couple of things, because again, I've always had this healthcare lenses on. So on one end, the regulation that allows for a framework, for innovation framework to exist across all industries has to be in place. That's a whole different conversation. And then on the other end, so when you talk about trade secrets, there is, again, what's relevant in the healthcare space is privacy for patient information. So I think this is also a conversation we have to have as we chatting on this particular topic, because we also, in Europe we have GDPR. It is a good framework that's deployed to sort of answer some of those questions. But I think in the United States, sometimes, patients they sort of sign off and they don't read a lot of legal information, especially the one that's in the very small print. And what they don't realize is they are providing without, a true consent, and sometimes without consent altogether. They allow for the companies to monetize the information. And I think once again, so we have to recognize that there is a problem, and I think we have to create legal framework for that. So again, the trade secret could be, a trade secret as far as the business is concerned, but it could be a patient-specific information that was used without their consent. And speaking of which, I think actually blockchain allows to mitigate some of those issues, because as you know, one of the amazing use cases, so blockchain allows for chain of custody controls. And unfortunately, especially in the healthcare space in pharma, it seems like we're at the stage where there are a lot of use cases that are published, but we don't deploy blockchain at scale. And I think it could really help to solve at least some of the patient data privacy concerns at stake, as well as some of the trade information once again.
There was a lot in what you mentioned, but I wanted to get back to GDPR and like some regulations that might not be familiar to some of our listeners. Could you talk a little bit about what is GDPR? How is this framework different from what we have in the US? And how does Chat GPT-4 is kind of falls into this space? And maybe in the broader sense, as you've lived in the US and now you live in Europe, you see the differences in regulatory landscape. If you could provide some kind of high-level overview, that would be very helpful.
Yeah, so I think what's important is to differentiate first the approach that the US is taking from Europe. So in the US, the regulatory approach for AI in the healthcare is driven by regulated medical devices that use AI for diagnostic purposes. And, that includes, machine learning algorithms. And the framework is based on a risk posed by the device and focused on ensuring safety and effectiveness. And in contrast, in Europe, Europe looks at the regulation that's necessary in a much broader sense. So the regulating AI is not just limited to medical devices. Europe had proposed a framework that focuses on ensuring human safety and rights, and allows for some transparency, but also for accountability, and as well as explainability is something that's demanded in writing in a lot of instances. Ensuring that AI systems are not only, also they're not discriminatory, which of course in the healthcare space has a whole different weight. And so the approach at its core is much broader. And I would say additionally, what's important to understand, right? So in Europe, healthcare is mostly centralized. In a lot of countries, healthcare is public. And in United States, you have a more fragmented of a healthcare systems, right? So you have a mix of private and public insurances. And the US generally is focused on a more permissive approach with focus on promoting innovation and growth in the industry, right? And Europe is taking a more cautious approach when it comes to AI in general and Chat GPT in general, if that makes sense.
It does. So I wanted to bring it to a more like practical level, like from a startup perspective. If a startup in the US that is using like Chat GPT-4 or a similar AI large language model technology and wants to enter the EU market, what are the things they should explore to ensure that they don't run into legal challenges?
Well, there is a lot from technical perspective. I mean, I think fundamentally, uh, again, if you're deploying AI, right, so you have, like I mentioned, right, so not to be repetitive, slightly different approach. So in Europe, it's a broader approach. And then also in Europe, you have to, that's combined with data storage. So it's not just about the AI. So from technical perspective in general, it's just a much broader approach. Although, especially when it comes to diagnostics, so in Switzerland, where I am right now, there is a conversation for allowing companies that went through FDA clearance and have that for the technology to be deployed in on the Swiss market without additional certification. That still would not be the case for the rest of Europe. It's but not the rest of EU, right? But still, I think there are some similarities, and I think the approach has to be based on a regulatory environment, which sometimes is specific to each country. If that makes sense. Rather than in the United States, it's a large market, right? So as long as you adhere to federal approaches, generally speaking, you're good to tackle all states.
So would you say it's easier for European startups to enter the US market then because there is less regulation and more support for innovation, and you have to deal with just federal regulators versus in EU, you have to deal with each individual country?
That is a really good question. So on one end, as far as the certification goes, yes, because again, you have HIPAA compliance is pretty straightforward. Yes, on one end, yeah, from technical perspective, yes. But I think, and I work with some startups, actually, some European startups that, just expanding in the US market or just recently had expanded, but still trying to make waves. So I think what's important it's not a linear yes or no. So on one hand, again, it's easier from technical requirement, but on the other hand, United States is a lucrative market. However, it has a lot of innovation, a lot of competition. And generally speaking, approach to innovation is, so you develop an MVP, you go test it. So it's a more rapid approach where in European market, and especially let's just talk about Switzerland. Switzerland per capita Switzerland has actually the most IP in the world, and it's a tiny country. So it surpasses United States quite significantly when it comes to innovation. So no shortage of great ideas here, but here people take time to deploy innovation, to test innovation, especially in the healthcare and pharma. So it's actually a complex, if we're really going to tackle these questions, complex conversation, but in theory, yes, from technical perspective and regulation, yes.
What I heard you say was regulation-wise, it's easier, but competition-wise, it's harder.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. We talked a lot about regulation, and there was a push a few weeks back from some prominent scientists and researchers in AI to actually introduce like a ban or some kind of a stop on development, moratorium for 6 months to figure out the regulatory landscape and understand what to do with all those innovations. What's your take on this initiative?
You're talking about the open letter?
The open letter, yes, exactly.
So another really good question. So I think I will kick it off by just noting that Altman, actually no one from OpenAI or Chat GPT had signed the letter. And
no surprises there.
But interestingly enough, Elon Musk had signed the letter, right? Yes. So which definitely was a bit of a surprise, I think, just for me. Once again, we have to create a framework, regulatory framework that answers a lot of questions. Just in this short conversation, we're sort of touching base on so many different topics and what ifs, right? And legally speaking, we have to answer those, I think. And I think largely this is why this letter does exist. And that's why a lot of scientists, are saying there is the framework is needed. And I think, one of the things, right, I think that's important to note is we're not there yet when it comes to artificial general intelligence, but we are moving there. And I think ChatGPT is probably, to a lot of experts in the industries, the most advanced push, the most advanced execution. And I think, which could be the reason why no one from the company had signed the letter, enjoying the benefits of their hard work. But I think there are a few things that are apparent to me, right? So we are closer to AGI. And I think especially, and not just in the healthcare industry, but in general, there are, regulatory issues. Just again, there are protection and data privacy issues. We touch base on those a little bit. There is a ethical consideration. And so all of those are large conversations we have to unpack. And then again, not unique to healthcare space, we have to create a plan for reskilling and upskilling of workers, of healthcare workers. And it's interesting because, on one end, not to deviate too much, right? So we have aging population in most all developed countries. And then we have the lack of healthcare workers. So, someone like myself would think that they would actually benefit the most from automation in general, and especially from ChatGPT automation of the tasks that, no one has time, to perform. But I think a lot of education is needed in this space, right? And we have to create a framework. And I think, these are the reasons why this letter exists and why people rightfully so are thinking that, is humanity ready for technology as it is today and for AGI, which we're moving rapidly towards.
Yeah, I think the idea was behind the letter just to give some time to regulators to keep up or catch up. But it doesn't look like it's happening. So from a perspective of an investor or even a startup founder who works in that space, how do you balance desire for innovation with ethical considerations in AI development?
As a entrepreneur myself, I think the way you balance is the reality is if you see a better way to solve a problem, or maybe to solve a problem in general that hasn't been solved yet using technology, you just do it. So I think the mentality of innovators is, we're solution focused rather than, regulation. We're not gonna, most of us, unless you're Martin Rothbard, you're not gonna write a book, right, on and she does have a legal, one of her degrees is she's a lawyer, right? So you're not going to write a book. You're just going to go solve a problem, deploy it, and you would hope that you are, in adherence with some potential future regulation, right? You obviously have to be in what exists today. So, I think there is that. And as far as, if I put my investor hat on, again, a good question, because this is what, when an experience and having worked in almost 2 decades in the healthcare space, this is where that expertise come into play, because sometimes you anticipate certain regulatory changes when you're evaluating a startup, and at times, a cautious approach is a much better approach, because if you foresee from your experience there will be a regulation which would make this investment a bad one tomorrow, maybe not today, you just don't do it. So, which is why I firmly believe that to be successful in the healthcare space as an investor, you ideally need to have not just a financial background, you have to have an industry and ideally innovator expertise as well to properly evaluate those startups, and a lot of friends, because I'll tell you this, often enough I do reach out to my friends with legal backgrounds, and I ask for their opinion.
So, you personally, are you more optimistic or pessimistic about where we're going with this artificial general intelligence? Are we going to enjoy the benefits of this innovation, or are we going to be eliminated as human race because of it?
Well, you're asking some big questions. I think well, again, we're not there yet, right?
Okay.
So let's just say that Chat GPT is sort of our first take, a first iteration of what it could be. And I think, personally, I am optimistic. I was one of the pioneers, right, using it, including for deal evaluation.
Mhm.
And again, I don't believe that it's going to augment, my or others' experience. But I think if used in conjunction with my expertise, I think it's very useful. And I think when we reach AGI, I think, my take is also very similar, right? So you're not full augmenting the human perspective. It's needed for a number of reasons. And even in NGI, some of the drawbacks I was mentioning earlier still will be applicable. But I'm overall optimistic. I think, so actually I was recently listening a podcast, and on the podcast, the CEO of Boston Dynamics was on. And one of the points he was making is when people start, fearing what they don't understand, which is programmed, right, from behavioral economics and neuroscience perspective, it's programmed into us with evolution, right? If we don't understand this, will this eat us? This is how it sort of started. And so there is that fear, but even one of the points he was making is even today, and this is, during COVID was even worse, right? There are, in logistics industry, there was simply not enough people doing the job of the robots. And even post-COVID, there are a lot of tasks that humans don't want to do anymore. So this is, deploying AI-enabled robots is very useful. So again, I understand the fear is there. I think we have to, with compassion as innovators, as technologists, answer the fear. And again, we have to follow with the regulation. But I'm overall optimistic.
I appreciate your optimism. It's good to hear this perspective. And I have my last question again for you, wearing your investor hat. For startups that are jumping or considering to jump into this AI space, specifically in healthcare, what opportunities are you seeing as the most compelling for you as an investor?
I have probably named 4 things. Assisting in diagnosis, again, we're not augmenting clinician there, but we are providing additional perspective. I think Chat GPT-4, it passed medical exams, so that does this pretty well. And RPM, there was a influx of RPM tools during COVID for a number of reasons, including there is a reimbursement now. So I think
like you mean remote patient monitoring, correct?
Yes, monitoring, exactly. So I think that's a second really good use. And I think here's the difference. In United States, this type of projects are pretty well funded, and in Europe, I still see an opportunity because we haven't deployed them very well. So it sort of depends on your location. I would say streamlining communication, which has an impact on productivity and efficiency for healthcare, that is really needed no matter where you are in the world. And ChatGPT-4 does a fabulous job with that. And, just I would say decision-making tools, and this is sort of broad. You could take it as, and answer this as you wish as an innovator. And I think that's a space that's, that's a good space, and we as investors will looking at it, whether it is we are in the United States or in Europe. So I think in this case, this is probably my top 4.
Is there anything else I haven't asked you, but you wanted to mention in the context of our conversation?
As I was thinking for these questions, I think it still is worthy to note maybe a few things, right, that could prevent innovation in the healthcare and pharma. And some of them I had talked about, and some of them just to briefly mention. I think we still have to solve interoperability. ChatGPT-4 or AI in general, right, relies on access to data. Healthcare and pharma loves to buy pinpoint solutions, and then you have more data silos. So we still have to answer that. I think there is and I've sort of mentioned it earlier, limited training and education and technology. So you have this cultural cautiousness, and then you have the lack of training. I think coupled together, it could prevent to ChatGPT-4 penetrating at scale in the industry. You have the resistance to change, which kind of contributes to this. And again, this is healthcare and pharma specific, sort of a cultural bias. We have to have conversations like this, right? We have to publish research to educate slowly, respectively, the society, clinical society. And then I think just in general, funding and resources, there are a lot of industries like finance industry that deploy appropriate funding to use technology like this at scale. And in the healthcare space, there is a lack of funding when it comes to ChatGPT-4 in a lot of instances. So those are probably the few things I wanted to mention.
Very cool. Thank you so much, Sasha, for your time and for your insights.
It is my pleasure.